Hey, welcome here. Let's dig in. Last week we talked about the Israelites and how God had placed a calling on their life, but how they repeatedly chose to ignore it, and as a result, were very often brought into seasons of exile where they were taken away from their homes into foreign lands where they would have to live for extended periods of time. And last week we looked at the book of Ezekiel, specifically chapter 11, where God makes Israel a promise that not only will he bring them out of exile, but he will give them a new heart, a new spirit. He'll actually change the thing internally that took them into exile to begin with. But this week we are looking at Jesus. Remember, Jesus every time. God is born. God is born into the story of humanity. After 400 years of silence with Israel, God is born into creation. And everything about God's entry into humanity is miraculous. From his birth to his life, his death, his resurrection, everything about it is this crazy miracle. And the most amazing thing to me is that God chooses to be born human. He has friendships with all the social anxieties. He has siblings with all the sibling rivalries that go on. He has family with all the dynamics that go in with family. And Jesus was actually taken into exile in Egypt when he was like maybe 2 or 3 because the king at the time, Herod, was trying to take his life. But more than that, Jesus lived and taught who God truly is and who you and I were always created to be. For a start, Jesus reveals that God is after our heart. He wants heart-to-heart relationship, and he cares about that way more than he cares about us making sure we do all of the right things, obeying all of the right rules. God is a God of relationship. In addition to that, Jesus shows us that God's power isn't wanting to just completely wipe us out for all the terrible things we've done. God's heart is for us. And Jesus shows us that God's expression of power isn't the taking and destruction of life. It's actually the giving of it, where Jesus himself, God himself, sacrifices his life. He chooses suffering so that you and I can have forgiveness. But imagine with me for a moment that you've just spent the last 3 years of your life with Jesus, following him around, listening to his teaching, and being transformed by him as you watch him and learn from him. And you have parents, siblings, friends who maybe weren't following Jesus, and so they haven't been changed the same way you have been. And so you start to feel more and more alone. What are you going to do with this? Who can you walk with who will understand, who will get the journey that you're on? This is where the church comes in, a group of people that are united around one leader and one mission. Last week, after looking at Ezekiel 11, one of you said, man, what would it be like if we were just that united, if we had this same heart, this same mind, the same spirit? The early church, they give us a really amazing glimpse into what it does and did and has and still today does look like when people lived unified by the Spirit of God and the mission and the message of Jesus Christ. The book of Acts tells us that Jesus' followers met together to pray, to worship, and to learn from the scriptures and the apostles' teaching. But it was way more than that. They would sell things that they didn't need so that they could take the proceeds of that and give it to the poor. They literally shared everything. They didn't have this thing that was like, well, this is mine and that's yours. They just said, yeah, if you need to borrow it, borrow it. And on top of that, they met with each other in their homes. They would break bread together, meaning they ate dinner. They had macaroni and cheese. They socialized around food and fellowship. They also suffered together. Not only did they share the joys, but they shared the sorrows as well. And you better believe that conflict did happen. But they were so unified around their mission that they just went and said, well, what would Jesus have us do in this? They discussed it, they worked it out, and they went forward in more unity than they had even before the conflict. The results of this was that people around them, the surrounding nations, were looking at how these people who were once religious and politically opposed, and they were watching how these people were now so unified, loving each other by caring for their poor, eating together, just sharing everything in common, caring for each other in deep times of turmoil. And that was drawing the nations, the people around the church, to Jesus because they were looking at the church and seeing how much the church loved each other. So How could people with such religious and political differences, different upbringings, different ethnicities, different backgrounds, different bias, you name it, every difference that could possibly be imagined, they had it. So how could a people that was so diverse be so incredibly unified? Well, the simple answer goes back to Ezekiel 11, where God says, I will change their heart. I will put a new spirit in them. The answer is God literally places his spirit into the heart of every single person who has trusted Jesus for the forgiveness of their sins. God literally comes to indwell them, and he changes their core person. Their core being is now orientated not away from God and into self, but towards God and towards others. It was God working from the inside out. But Carter, if this is true, and if the Spirit of God, this great unifying force, is in the heart of every believer, why are there so many divisions in the church? That's a good question. And we're going to get into that a little bit more next week. But for this week, I want you guys to take a look at a passage in the book of Acts where it describes what the early church was like. And before we ask what went wrong, let's spend this week asking what went right. That's it for now, though. We'll see you next week.